Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone who's joined this AI for You OrbitalAI Challenge pitching webinar. I'm just going to quickly go over the administrative things. So this webinar is being recorded, just so you're aware that your name could be visible on the recording itself, and or if you ask any questions. To ask questions, please use the Q&A, where we will be able to see which kind of questions you're asking, and then we will answer them either during the presentation or at the end. If there's any questions we don't get to, we will make sure that they get answered after the webinar. And then I would like to introduce you to Ginny Radmal, who's our trainer for today on pitching. She is the coach and director of the Ivy Way. And in that capacity, she is supporting companies or corporates like Google, Microsoft, Techstars in their storytelling, leadership, and pitching. And today she's going to teach you all about how to prepare your pitch for the OrbitalAI Challenge. Ginny, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And yes, I want to echo the welcome at the beginning to anyone who's joining wherever you are. I am hoping that in this workshop, we can give you some really tangible frameworks for how to transform the way that you pitch. And one thing that might be helpful for you to know right from the beginning is I formally trained as an actor before moving into the world of corporate training. So some of the things that we're going to look at later in this workshop around how to use your voice, how to use your body language, how to even control nerves when you're speaking, come from that background or that experience in acting. And as well as now training corporate companies and startups on how to pitch, I also work with members of Parliament across the Commonwealth Parliamentarian Association. So lots of training, lots of different people every year on how to speak and how to make sure that when you talk, you're actually getting people to sit up and listen. So to set an agenda for the workshop, what we're going to cover across the next 40 minutes, we're going to be looking firstly at what are some of the challenges you might have when you are pitching. What are the habits that I see lots of different founders making? We're then going to look at what to include in that 3-minute pitch video. So what content to cover. And then we're going to move on to how you actually bring that to life. So what are some ways of simplifying that language, of making sure that what you think you're saying and what you're actually saying are the same thing. And then we're going to change tact for the last 10-15 minutes of the workshop and look at some of those other elements of what do you do with your body language, how do you use your voice, and also what do you do when you're speaking to a camera, what are some of those best practices to make sure that your video is as good as it possibly can be. But to set the scene for today, I want to take you through something which is called the tapping experiment. There's a brilliant book on how to communicate well, and it's called Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller. And in this book, the author talks about an experiment that he did with a huge group of people where he divided the room into people who were tapping and people who were listening. And he asked the people who were tapping to think of a really popular song that they knew of and the person that they were paired with might know of. And they asked the people who were listening to the tapping to try and guess what the song was. For example, one person might be thinking of Happy Birthday or We Will Rock You, and they would tap out or clap out the rhythm to that song. The person listening would have to try and guess it. And what he found was time and time again, even though the song would be really obvious to the person who was tapping, it wasn't always very obvious to the person who was listening. And the way he uses this in his book is he says something really similar sometimes happens when we're trying to communicate a pitch or a presentation or an idea that you've been working on, like the ones that all of you are working on, which is that sometimes we think we're communicating something that makes sense, that is more like music, when in fact it's a little bit more like noise. He says in his book, we're either serving our audience or descending them into confusion. We might either make music for them or we make noise. And it's your job when you are pitching and when you're communicating to make sure that you are communicating music for your audience, something that makes sense, that brings your idea to life in a way that actually gets people on the edge of their seat, desperate to hear more. So the starting point for this workshop is, what are some of the challenges that you might experience when you're pitching? And I'd love you to take a second to think about what might some of the things be that you find hard. Some of you might not have done lots of pitching before. For others, you might have done more presenting within a university setting, whether that's as a student, a lecturer, a professor. But it's a little bit different when it comes to pitching your idea. I coach around 1,000 people every year. And so the common challenges that I see people make are firstly trying to cram too much information into the pitch. You've got 3 minutes. And what often I see people do is they see that as an opportunity to try and say as much as humanly possible. And what tends to happen with that is we speed up, because there's only so much you can say in 3 minutes before you have to go incredibly fast. And you often lose people because our brains just get overwhelmed with the amount of information. Second to that would be overcomplicating the language. Now, I imagine that you are all highly intelligent people who know your areas inside and out. And so when you are explaining certain parts of your AI model and what you've developed, it will be very easy to get stuck into the weeds, to overcomplicate and give too much detail. And again, it's your job to work out, when have you said enough? And what do we actually need to know to understand what you're proposing? And the final one is just not bringing the idea to life, lacking a kind of narrative, or not thinking about how is it you want the audience to feel, or what do you want them to be thinking about what it is that you're doing. Now, as was explained at the beginning of the workshop, we'd love to make this interactive and for you to ask any questions that you have throughout this. So if you know that you have something particular that you find challenging when it comes to communicating, when it comes to pitching, feel free to put that in the Q&A for us, or to ask a question if there's, you know that you often speed up, or you use lots of filler words, so those ums, ahs, likes when you're talking, or you don't know what to do with your hands, or don't know how to simplify the pitch. Feel free to ask questions as we go through this, and it gives me a good idea of what would be most helpful to go through in this webinar. If there's anything relevant that comes up as we go through, then I will answer that for you on the spot. And otherwise, I'll make sure that I answer any extra questions at the end of this session. We've deliberately left some time for that as well. But always worth bearing in mind, what are things that you might find hard, and what might you need to consider being aware of when you're pitching. So then the next thing that helps frame how you create a compelling pitch is some research that was taken from a brilliant book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Really recommend reading it. But I'm going to simplify what he says within that book. And he talks about the 2 systems through which we process the majority of information that we receive every day. He talks about how we make decisions in the moment. And he says there are 2 parts of our brain that we use most often when we're trying to make a decision. The first is our limbic system, and this is a very old prehistoric part of our brain, responsible for sensing any threat, any immediate danger in a space. It's also quite an emotive gut reaction part of how we process information. So if a tiger was to walk into the room you're in right now, your limbic system would be firing, probably your amygdala as well, a few other parts of your brain and your body, but it would be the part that is being used to sense whether you need to get out or not. The other part of our brain we use when we're making decisions would be our neocortex. And as the name suggests, it's a newer part of our brain. We use it when we're trying to decipher or break down a really complicated maths problem, something that makes your brow thorough and you really have to think quite carefully about the answer. And what he showed through his research is that 95% of the decisions that we make are through our limbic system, that gut emotive response part of how we operate. And just 5% was through our neocortex, that more complex processing, decision-making side of how we work. And what that means when it comes to pitching is if you cram your pitch with loads and loads of data and information and stats, and you forget about the fact that we also respond emotionally or emotively to what we're saying, you're missing a huge opportunity. So you need to get us to care about what you're talking about, not just give us the information and the facts. And so we're going to spend a bit of time later talking about how you can do that and how you bring your content to life. Another theory that backs this up is used in all of Amazon's meetings when they have their big boardroom meetings around the table. there's something that they do, which is known as the empty chair principle. And some of you might be familiar with Amazon's story. And so Jeff Bezos leaves a empty chair, physically empty chair around that table. And the idea is to try and make sure that they are thinking about who they actually serve, i.e. their customers. And there's a book called To Sell is Human by Daniel Pink, and he adopts the same principle where he says that you need to almost imagine or visualize who you're talking to. When you're recording the pitch video in a couple of months' time, it's really easy to forget that you're actually speaking to human beings who will have that live response to what you're saying. And if you are thinking or visualizing who it is that you need your message to land for, that can really help you frame your narrative. But there's another brilliant tool which will help you work out what to keep in your pitch and what to get rid of. And it's what you can see on the screen right now. It's called Think, Feel, and Do. So when I work with founders, one of the biggest challenges that I know they have is trying to distill some of the information. We want to say everything about our startup, about our idea, when in fact often the audience just need to get curious about what it is that you're saying. So the first thing you need to think of is, what is the key message you need your audience to take away? In other words, what do you want your audience to be thinking through your pitch? And once you've identified that, it's worth having that at the top of your script. So when you're building the content for your pitch, instead of being overwhelmed with ideas, if you can work out that one thing you need us to take away, you need us to remember, it gives you such a good steering point for then what you need to add to the pitch. So what content should be coming in, and actually what you don't need, because it doesn't add to that key message that you've identified. So always worth knowing, determining, what does that thing need to be that your audience take away and that they remember? And even through a 3-minute pitch, working out how you might reiterate that, not multiple times, not too many times, because it can get a bit tiring for the audience. The next thing to consider, and I think we forget about this all too often, is how do you want to make your audience feel? I mentioned just earlier that we have that emotive response to a pitch. And Malcolm Gladwell says that there's normally 3 responses when we're hearing somebody speak. We're either bored by what they're saying, and I'm sure none of you will ever do that when you're pitching. Second is we are vaguely interested. So this is where you might see somebody nodding, or maybe an occasional smile as you see them reacting to what you're saying. But he says where you need to get somebody to so they take action and do something is you need to inspire them. You need to bring your idea to life or talk about it in a way which you look like you're inspired, so you in turn help us feel inspired. Because we've got mirror neurons in our brain, which means that what you give us when you're speaking tends to be returned back to you. So if you sound really bored as you're talking about your model or about the solution you're providing or the impact, it is so hard for the audience to get on board and feel that sense of excitement. Always worth identifying, how do you want to make us feel, and what will you need to do to get us there? And I'm going to show you some really practical techniques later for how you can bring some of that emotion through. And finally, what is your call to action? What do you want to do in response? In a second, we're going to go through what to include within the 3 minutes. And you actually need to have in that 3 minutes what your call to action is. So why you? What is it you want out of this pitch? So worth jotting down, maybe on your script, maybe on your piece of paper if you've got one in front of you now, when you're thinking about building your pitch, building your idea, how can you work out what you want to think, your audience to think, feel, and do? And actually, just on that, before we move on, when you're practicing your pitch, because I would really recommend practicing your pitch out loud, this is also a good model to ask somebody who you're pitching to. So to say to them, what did you remember from my pitch? Or how did that make you feel as I was speaking? What sort of action would you want to take off the back of this? But especially that first piece with what did you think or what do you remember? If you are wanting a particular key message to stand out, but you've pitched this to multiple people and they are all landing on a very different message as the key message, then you need to change something up within your pitch to make sure that that key message actually comes through. So what do you include within the content of your pitch? Let's run through this so you have an idea of what you need to include. And just so you know, in case you're furiously taking any notes, I will be sharing the slides and some other resources on the other side of this training. The first thing you need to do is to make sure you're grabbing our attention. And that might be through the team, talking about the team right at the beginning of the pitch. It might be a one-liner which sums up what you do, but you need to start with something that gets us on the edge of our seats, ready to listen to you speak. And you need to jump into who your team are and why they're the right team to be working on this. And then you need to talk us through your value proposition. So what is it you're doing? Who is the customer that you serve? And what is your USP? What is it that you uniquely do? Then you're going to talk through your AI model, and you can see the suggestion of how you break down the content for this pitch. And this is where the suggestion is to allocate most of your time here to talk through the model. And then the last couple of sections would be talking about the impact of the solution. So what difference does it make having your solution in the world? And then finally, what is the call to action? So let me break this down for you in a little bit more detail. So first off, the very first sentence that you say is otherwise known as the hook. One of my favorite TED Talks is by Andrew Stanton, and he's the filmmaker from Toy Story and WALL-E. And he says that every good story starts with a promise to the audience that this is worth their time. When you have a panel who are listening to multiple pitches or watching multiple pitch videos again and again and again, you need to convince them right from the start that this is worth listening to. So this exact same quote can be translated to every good pitch should start with that promise to the audience, this is worth their time. And one key way of doing that might be that you begin with your team. So you present the team that is making this innovative idea and AI model possible. One of the things I see a lot when people are presenting their team, and I used to think that it was just a British thing, but I work with companies in the US, all over Europe and in Asia as well. And I no longer think it's just a British thing, but what we tend to do when we're speaking about ourselves or our team is we don't want to brag. One of the key phrases I hear from founders when working on their team side is, I don't want to sound arrogant. And what we end up doing instead is we actually end up apologizing for our team, because instead of talking about the experience they have and bringing the gold to the surface, we end up minimizing the experience that the team actually has and dumbing it down or watering it down slightly. So I hear a lot of filler words or the speed rushing right through the introduction to the team. But this is the thing that we will be buying into. It's a huge asset, the people who are working with you on this project. So it's worth making sure that you help us understand why you are the right people to be doing this. And it's sometimes easier to actually get somebody else to think of or to script this part of the pitch for you. So within your team, one exercise that I recommend doing is to sit down and have a conversation about what's your experience, what are your background, what's the bits of gold that we really need to know. And then actually to ask somebody else in your team to script the piece about yourself, to script that one sentence about you, because it's easier to write that on behalf of somebody else than sometimes to be presenting it or to be coming up with that script ourselves. Either way, we need to know what some of the best bits about the team are. All too often, this slide sounds too much like a eulogy of information rather than a living, breathing team who are doing some brilliant things together. So make sure you're not minimizing, make sure we are getting a sense of just how brilliant you and the team are. So this is the next chunky section, which is your value proposition. And this is an idea of how you might lay out your value proposition. Now, my caveat here is I've written this up as one sentence. I would probably recommend breaking this into 2 sentences. One of the worst things you can do, especially near the beginning of your pitch, is have long sentences, because it will force you to speed up as you're speaking. And then you lose the audience right from the get-go. But an idea of how you frame your value proposition, how you talk about what it is you're doing and the value it brings, is to use a sentence structure like this. My project, and then to enter the name of the project there, is developing, and then tell us what your offering is. And then tell us who it is you are helping. So who is the audience that you serve? And then the final piece would be to solve a problem with X. So it's bringing in what is the problem that you are serving for your customers, and what's the secret sauce that you're using to do that. So chunk this down into what's your project, what are you developing, and who do you help? Actually, sorry, I'd say what's your project, what is it you're developing, and then probably as a second sentence, who is it you help and what is the problem that you are helping them overcome. So chunk it down a bit, make it into 2 nice, short, snappy sentences so that you're not running out of breath or giving us too much information to remember. The best pitches I see are when they actually make the information bite-sized rather than throwing it all at once. Sometimes it feels a bit like we are having an entire chocolate cake of information thrown in our face. And even though the information is good, it's not digestible, it's not broken down. So make sure you chunk it down for us. The next piece is where you should be spending most of the time, so about 50 seconds talking about the AI model. So you need to talk us through how it works and how it is adapted for running on board the satellite. So make sure you give us an idea of what that looks like and how it works. Talk us through some of that in a little bit more detail. And you've deliberately been given time to do so. So again, think about the short sentences, think about distilling the information down. An exercise that I often do with founders who are really in the technical weeds, stuck in some of the detail, is getting people to write down what are the 3 acronyms, buzzwords, bits of jargon that you would most commonly use when you are trying to describe what your offering is or what it is that you do. And once you've identified those 2 or 3 words, you then need to write down what your offering is without them. And this is an exercise just to try and get you to think outside of the box. So instead of being stuck to some of the detail or getting too much in the weeds, it's about working out what's another way of framing that. And it's not to say that when you're creating your pitch video, you can't be using some of those acronyms or some of the buzzwords, jargon, things that will help us understand what it is you're doing. It's just it sometimes gives us an alternative way of framing it that can actually be more useful. When I hear founders talk more conversationally about what it is they do after I've listened to them pitch, time and time again, I end up saying to them, why didn't you just tell me that? Because when you spoke conversationally, when you broke it down in a more simple way, it made so much more sense. But I think one of our fears is we're so petrified of sounding stupid or dumbing something down too much that we end up just going for the overly complex, too wordy version of it. So make sure you're getting the right amount of simplicity versus some of the detail in there. And then the next piece is, how does your solution impact the industry or research or environment or just society as a whole? So you don't need to cover every aspect of this. You might pick out 2 of these, so going a little bit more high level to society as a whole and then digging down into how it might impact research or the industry. But make sure that you really sell this point. We want to know not just what you do, but actually why does that matter? What is the impact? And this is one of the parts of the pitch where it's worth thinking about the tonality of your voice as well. You should be inspiring us to think a little bit differently about what could be possible through your solution. Some of you might have seen Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. And what you might notice through almost every Hollywood story is there are a few plot twists or moments where the narrative shifts from a problem that a character is facing. So we might find Frodo stuck in the pit of despair, and then we see Gandalf come in. So we see Frodo attacked by the giant spider or the hobbits captured by the orcs. And it's usually in those moments where the hero of the story or the main character doesn't know what to do that the wise mentor comes in. And similarly, when you're pitching, what we should be getting a sense of is, who is that hero? Who is the customer you serve? And where do you come in as the wise mentor? So the good news is you end up being a bit like Gandalf or Dumbledore or Yoda, if you prefer, within this narrative, because you give your customers something they need to help them overcome a challenge. And then we should be hearing what difference that makes. What do you enable people to do that they weren't able to do before? What impact does it make? And the last thing you need to cover is why you? So not going back into the team slide, but what's that call to action? What is it you want to leave us with at the end of your pitch? Too many pitches start really strong, have a great middle, and then they just end. And the sentence that I would love to ban everyone from saying when they end their pitch is, so that's it, as a final sentence, because you undo so much of the work that you've just done when you enable the pitch or allow the pitch just to collapse like that. So think again about what's that closing sentiment that you want to leave us with? What should be ringing in our ears? What is it, the message that you're wanting to leave us with? So I want to show you a quick example of how you might be able to put some of this together. And this is a pitch taken from a very different context. It was from the HG Summit that happened in Paris back in 2019, so pre-pandemic. And this is a company called Atomos, who I worked with a few years ago now to help them develop their pitch. And even though the structure and the content of what they're saying is slightly different because they weren't part of a program like this, it will give you some idea of how you can make something come to life a bit. Quite a complex solution, quite a complex problem as well that they're solving. But the way that they tell this story in just a minute is really compelling. So I'd love you to have a listen to this and maybe listen out, watch out for some of the elements that we've been describing so far through this workshop. I'm hoping the sound is going to work, but you have to, well, I'm sure we'll figure out if it's not.
When I flew to Paris, I landed at Charles de Gaulle Airport, like many of you here, probably. But what if there was no airport to land at? What if there were no connecting flights? What if there was no train to get to the venue? What if I had to buy the jet outright, land it here at the venue? It would be exorbitantly expensive and inefficient. As crazy as it is, this is how we put satellites into space. At Atomos, we are building and operating space tugs. These are the connecting flights and last mile transportation solutions for satellites. And the technology that we use is not normal. We're using the technology of tomorrow. Nuclear electric propulsion is the technology that will allow us to go sustainably back to the moon and take humans to Mars in less than 2 months. This is not just a commercial business. This is the infrastructure for space tomorrow.
Brilliant. Well, I hope that's given you some food for thought as you're watching that. It's for me, what always stands out is the language that she uses at the beginning. So it's very metaphorical at the start. So I mentioned that the pitch event was happening in Paris. So she talks about coming into Charles de Gaulle Airport as everybody in the room would have done, and that comparison to what it's like currently trying to get, or at the time getting, space tugs into space. And then at the end, the vision that she sets is so compelling. So as I said, even though the content of what you're talking about will be slightly different, it's worth sometimes seeing other people pitch to give you that sense of how do you turn the content into something that's compelling, and how do you think also a bit about your tonality as you're speaking to bring your pitch to life. So what I want to move on to next, because we've talked a little bit about content and overcoming particular challenges with the content side of things, is what you can be doing with your pitch delivery. If we have time near the end, I'll show you one other pitch example from a company actually in the ag tech space, so slightly different focus from what any of you will be looking at potentially. But what I want to talk you through now is how to think about the delivery of your pitch. Once you've got that brilliant content down, you've figured out those short, punchy sentences, bringing some of the idea you're working on to life, then that's all well and good until you actually think about what you're doing with your voice or your body language. It makes up a huge amount of what we communicate. And when it comes to your voice, when it comes to thinking about what you're doing with those different aspects, it is worth thinking about what actually happens when we're speaking. We often just think that we open our mouth and the words come out, but actually there is a whole host of other things that are involved in us breathing and taking a breath, and how we stand or how we sit when we're speaking. So this is a good moment to get you to think about how you're currently sat in your chair right now, or maybe you're sat on a really comfy sofa somewhere at home, or you're watching this on the train, who knows? But I imagine because you are human beings and it is hard to sit up tall continuously, that you're slightly slouched over as you're stood there or as you're sat there. And I am not judging anyone for that. But what it is worth considering is that when we slouch or when we take up slightly less space as we're talking, we actually constrict the amount of space that we have in our lungs to breathe. And that in turn affects our vocal projection, so how clear we can get our voice to sound, or how loud, how pure the quality is. So as you are sat there now, what I'd like you to think about or to imagine is that you actually have a golden piece of string coming all the way through the center of your body. For those of you that missed the introduction near the beginning, I mentioned that I trained as an actor, and this is one of the fundamentals of what we learned in our first year of training, was all about posture and taking up space. So if you're sat on a chair, just make sure your feet are flat on the floor, squidge forward slightly nearer the front so that you're not leant into the back of it. And just imagine that that piece of string is pulling you upwards, a little bit like a puppet. So and you can even actually, if it helps, bring your hand above your head and imagine pulling up that piece of string just to give you a bit more height. Now, what I would actually recommend when it comes to creating your pitch video in a few months' time is that you are stood on your feet. So when you're standing up, you naturally have more energy. You might be able to tell I'm currently standing up in my office at home. I often do this for webinars and for workshops because I know it gives me more energy. Even at the end of a long day of coaching, this is definitely the best option for me as I'm speaking to you all now. And then when you're standing up, what you need to think about is what you're doing with your feet. Your feet should always be shoulder width apart. Your toes should hopefully be facing forwards, a bit like you're going skiing. And again, you can imagine that golden piece of string coming all the way up through the center of your body and pulling you up from the top of your head. When you take up space, it also affects your cortisol levels. So when we're feeling really stressed, some of you might have seen one of the most famous TED Talks by Amy Cuddy, who speaks about we often have our arms crossed in front of our body, our hands in our pockets or behind our back. And when we do any of those positions, when we're adopting one of those poses, we actually often encourage our body to produce more cortisol. It makes us feel more stressed. And so we need to do the opposite of what our brain is telling us to do. So try and have your hands down by your sides or maybe around the same height as your waist so that you're actually able to use them when you're talking and to remain nice and open. The next thing to think about beyond that is how you are breathing. Now, I imagine, because you're all human beings, that when you are about to speak or when you are first recording something or speaking in front of people, that your heart will start to race because that is a normal physiological response to stress. And as our heart beats faster, our breathing becomes shallower, and it is much more difficult to take that supported breath from our diaphragm. When you are exercising or when you're sleeping at night, you're naturally taking in some quite nice breaths that start from your diaphragm, so right at the bottom of your rib cage. So if you know you struggle with your breathing when you're speaking, if you feel that influx of nerves or those butterflies in your tummy, one of the best things you can do is take a second to breathe, to slow down your breath, maybe even to put your hand onto your stomach just above where your belly button is, which is the bottom of your rib cage where your diaphragm muscles wrap all the way around back of your body as well, around your back. If you have your hand there, not while you're pitching, but before you start to record, take some nice deep breaths in through your nose and out through your mouth, and try and do that really gently a few times over. When you're doing that, when you're breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth, you're actually taking in 20% more oxygen than when you're just breathing in through your mouth. And again, when we're nervous, we often inhale quite quickly through our mouth, which makes our mouth quite dry, but it also restricts the amount of oxygen you can take in, which is pretty crucial when you're feeling nervous and you get that influx of nerves. So worth slowing down your breath. So a few other things I want to touch on is body language when you're pitching. So what you'll see here in this picture on the right is a few quite senior people in an investment bank that I was working with doing the string exercise. And in fact, a couple of years ago, somebody literally stopped me in the middle of Texas, one of the airports in Texas, I think it was Austin, and he stopped and did the string in front of me. So once you learn the exercise of imagining that piece of string pulling you upwards, it's very hard to forget. So other things to consider for your video is making sure that you're actually using your hands when you're talking. So if you're describing for us parts of the model and how it works, maybe talking us through a process, then there's probably something visual that you could show us to help bring that to life, to signpost us through some of the information that you have in that part of the pitch. So think about how you might be able to visualize and translate that for us. Also, when you're describing the problem or who your offering serves, there might be a statistic that you want to mention there or something that brings it to life. And when you're using numbers, when you're pitching, if you're talking about something that is big, it is worth bringing your hands out to show us the size of what you're speaking about. If you're wanting to show us how small something is, so how easy it is to use your solution or how much it reduces time or whatever for your customers, then try and make us see and understand just how small that is for, again, what you're physicalizing, what you're doing visually. One of the best things you can remind yourself of when you're practicing this is be deliberate with your hands, be specific about some of those gestures. You don't need to choreograph your entire pitch, because that will be tiring and probably slightly weird to watch back, but it is worth thinking about how you can add. And the last point goes without saying, you're not going to be able to walk around when you're pitching. You're probably going to be on one spot presenting your pitch to the camera. So you're going to have to try and keep your feet nice and still, and instead get some of that energy into the top half of your body instead. So the last thing I want to talk through with you in terms of what you're doing with the delivery of the pitch is how you're using your voice. The voice is one of the most powerful instruments you have at your disposal, but we don't always use it particularly well. And there are a few things that are worth considering. The first is your volume as you're speaking. Now, when you are doing a video pitch, then often your microphone, even if it's just the one built into your laptop, is able to adjust even if you're speaking slightly quietly. But when you're speaking quietly, you can often tell because of the diction that comes through in someone's voice, or just how clear the words are. So it's worth taking those slightly deeper breaths from the bottom of your diaphragm, from your stomach, to make sure that what you're saying has that punch. The next thing is your tonality. And I mentioned this earlier on, but when you are talking about what it is you do, the team that are behind this, and the impact that this makes on society or on research, you should sound excited. The easiest thing you can do when you're speaking is to smile, because when you change the shape of your mouth, you change the sound of your voice, because you change how the sound is reverberating around your mouth or resonating around your mouth. So think about smiling as you're speaking, especially on those parts of the pitch where you're talking about good news or the impact of what you're doing. The other thing to take into consideration is, one, the pace. So in a 3-minute pitch, you should be aiming to speak at around 140, 150 words per minute. If you are somebody who scripts out your pitch, and in fact, your word count is way over that per minute, you need to make sure you're adjusting and chopping back down again, just so you give yourself time to breathe, and therefore time for the audience to breathe as you're speaking. And then the final thing to note is your diction, that sharpness of the words. So a couple of things I always do before I speak, especially if I'm talking in the morning, is to make sure that I've actually warmed up my jaw. So I sometimes give myself just a really gentle jaw massage. Maybe you want to do this now, especially if you're watching this in the morning. When we sleep, we often have a slightly locked or tight jaw, which means that we only open our mouth about this much, and that's where the words start to get lost. So think about really over-enunciating. You're talking about something you've worked really hard on. Don't let us miss what you're saying just because your diction is sloppy. I used to work as an actor, and one of the things that we would notice at the end of every performance on stage is that there would be a slight shine on the stage. And you might see this next time you go to the theatre. And it's because we used to almost spit our words out as we were speaking. So I'm not suggesting you spit as you're talking, but keep that principle in mind of thinking about overusing your mouth, making sure those words come out, so that it adds to the confidence in your pitch. So take a second to breathe before you speak, stand nice and tall when you're talking, and consider the tonality in your voice to add that level of excitement when you're pitching. And the final few things to think about are, when you're recording, what your setup looks like. Now, your tech setup does not need to be expensive. You do not need to go out and buy a whole new rig of items. But what I would recommend is considering a couple of things. Firstly, your lighting. I'm stood in front of a window right now, and that gives me a little bit of natural light. And I've also got a ring light, so one of those circular lights to my left, and then a desk lamp to my right. So nothing super high tech at all. But general principle, you want to make sure that you have more light coming towards your face than you do behind you in the room. Otherwise, that's when you start to look a bit washed out or a bit shadowy. So just put a desk lamp on the desk in front of you, and that will light you nicely. Your camera should be at the same height as your eyes. So if you're going to record this sat down, then make sure that you've got your laptop or your camera on top of a pile of books, just so it's at the same level as your eyes. And you should be looking into the camera when you're speaking. So if you're looking around at your notes or you're reading your notes, it will be very obvious because we have quite a zoomed in version of your face. So try and learn your script off by heart, or learn some of the talking points off by heart, so that you can actually look at the camera when you're speaking. It helps build connection with the audience. If you're standing up, then what I've simply got here is my desk and a chair with my laptop on top of it. Again, nothing high tech. And then the final thing just to leave you with in terms of the tech setup is, if you are fortunate enough to have a MacBook and an iPhone, you can actually sync or connect your iPhone to your MacBook and use that as your camera and your microphone. So if you don't have a particularly good inbuilt webcam in your laptop or your computer, you can actually use your iPhone as an alternative instead. So you just have to Google, it's called continuity camera for anyone that's interested. You can just type that into Google and look at how to set it up. It's very, very simple. So have a think about some of those elements when you are recording your pitch. Take a moment to consider your tech setup and how to make sure that it is giving. You've got great lighting, you're thinking about the audio as you go through as well. We've got about 4 minutes left, and I would love to know if there are any questions that you've had throughout the last 40 minutes of this workshop, or anything that, any habits or things that you find challenging when you're pitching. So we're going to leave a bit of space and see if anyone would like to ask anything. No question is off limits. You are very welcome to put anything out there, even if it's not something we've discussed, but is under the bracket of pitching and communicating. Please let us know. This is your opportunity to ask any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Ginny. This was really inspirational and really interesting. I think you've brought across the message that the way your message very clearly. So it's a very good example for everyone who will need to send in their pitch, because I don't see any questions whatsoever from anyone in the audience. Or maybe it's a lot to digest at the moment.
Maybe.
If there are no further questions, or no questions from anyone, they might come up once you start making the pitch video. I would then say, so all of the information that was given here today will be shared. The webinar is also recorded, so the recording will be shared. And then if you have any further questions, you can always reach the AI for EO team on support@ai4eo.eu. Yeah, I think that leaves me with nothing else, Ginny, than to say thank you very much. Oh, there is a question. Good. No question, but thank you very much. It was very interesting and clear.
Thanks, Adrian.
Yes, thank you very much, Ginny. This was wonderful. Wonderful to have you here, and I wish all of you that are here present this evening, or wherever you are in the world, a very nice rest of the day, or a nice evening, and hope to see some great pitches from you.
Thank you very much.